Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we will talk about the different selection tools. It's still a pretty basic tutorial, but designing in 3D is selecting things for 90% of the time, and that in several ways, so it's better that I show you right now the tools we will use later. So the different selection tools are here. If we click and hold on the first icon, we bring up the list of all selection tools. I quickly show you the first called Tweak. It's the most basic of all. It is a simple point-and-click mode. Nothing surprising, but it allows me to show you how to make a multiple selection. Let's imagine we want to select all the elements of the Gauss flare. We just have to hold down the Shift key and simply click on each object we want to add to selection. And to remove an object from the selection, you guessed it, just hold down the Shift key and click again on a selected object. If I click this way on this object, it works. But if I click on this other object there, it does not work. But you may have noticed something happened. The outline surrounding the object has changed color. Let's do it again so you can see it clearly. The outline's color changes from an orange, let's say a dark orange, to a lighter orange. Open your ears wide. I'm going to explain something fundamental in Blender. When we make a multiple selection, we can have one of our objects which stands out from the others. We then call this object the active element, and to clearly distinguish it from the other objects, it is outlined with a light orange color. The active element serves as a reference for several operations. It's a bit like the big brother of the other selected objects, but we'll see that later. In Blender, to determine which is the active element of a selection, we use Shift and click. If we add objects to a selection with Shift and left click, as we just did before, the last object added to the selection automatically takes on the active element role. And if you click again on an already selected object, this object becomes the active element. It can be confusing, but at the same time it's a super fast way to determine the active element, which we will see later is very useful. So if I shift click on an object that is not the active element, I transform this object into an active element without deselecting it. On the other hand, if I shift click on the active element, it will be deselect. I hope I haven't lost you too much with this active element story. You will understand later the interest of the active element, but in the meantime, remember, if you want to remove an object that is not the active element of a selection, you just have to hold Shift and double click on it. The first click will turn it to active element, and the second click will deselect it. Now let's move on a tool that we will use very often, the Select Box tool. This tool works like in a lot of software, or even like several real-time strategy video games. We draw a rectangle, and everything inside the rectangle will be selected. Note that all objects have been selected at the same time, so there is no active element here, because no object was selected last. If we want to complete the selection, it's the same shortcut as with Tweak tool. We maintain Shift, and we add new objects to our selection. So that's mean we cannot use Shift key to remove objects from selection. So to remove objects from selection, we use the Control key. With this Select Box tool, we can also do a simple click on objects with the Shift key pressed, and it will behave exactly like the Tweak tool. We can add objects, we can turn an object into active element, and we can remove the active element from the selection. Here we have different mode of selection. Personally, I never use them, or almost, but I show you so you know what it's for. Here we are using new selection mode. It simply means that each time we make a selection without using the Shift or Control keys, we start from nothing and we make a new selection each time. If we choose additive mode, objects inside the rectangle will be appended to the selection, just like holding down the Shift key. Conversely, with subtractive mode, objects inside the rectangle are removed, exactly as if we held down the Control key. With difference mode, it becomes a bit conceptual. For each object inside the rectangle, the objects already selected are removed from the selection, and those which were not selected are added to the selection. In a way, this mode is an invert selection tool, but only for what's inside the rectangle. With intersection mode, we keep the selection of all the objects inside the rectangle, and we remove those that are outside. So it's the opposite of the subtractive mode. I show you this not to encourage you to use these different modes, but in order you can judge yourself the interest of these modes, to know if you should pay attention to them. For my part, I ignore them. Most of the time we can make multiple selections very quickly by simply using the Shift and Control keys. Then we have Select Circle. It's a tool that simply allows us to paint the selection with a kind of brush. So we can adjust the size of the brush here, and we just add objects to the selection by hovering over them with the left mouse button pressed. But here is a trick. To add an object to the selection with the circle tool, if hovering over it like that, the object is not added. For it to work, you have to fly over the origin of the object. Do you remember? The origin is the little orange dot that we have already seen together in the video about rotations. By default, Blender only displays the origins of selected objects, but for help you to understand, I'm going to go to the Overlay menu and ask Blender to display the origins of all objects. So we can now see a lot of little white dots. They represent the origin of all objects. And so there, if I fly over the geometry of this blade, nothing happens, but if I fly over its origin, which is around here, it works. And then we have the lasso. It works exactly like a select box, except that instead of drawing a square, we draw a free shape. So this tool can be quite good to be precise when we want to select objects that are very close to other objects we don't want to select. On the other hand, just like the Select Circle, with Select Lasso, we need to surround the origin of an object to select it. If I do not surround the origin, it does not work. That's all about the basic selection tools. We also have other tools in the Select menu here that gives us access to commands that allow us to make selections without the mouse. But for the moment, we will not use them. Except maybe the Select All command, whose shortcut is the A key. This one is super useful. For example, when we open Blender, each time, we always have a cube, a light, and a camera. So the first thing we do when we open Blender is press A to select everything, and press X to delete everything. The other commands are interesting, but too contextual, so we will talk about them in future videos if we need to use them. At this stage of the different videos, we learned how to control the view. We learned how to transform objects with different types of transformations, and we learned how to make selections. And in fact, doing 3D is repeating these three operations in a loop. We adjust the view, we make a selection, we transform our selection, and we change view again, we select another objects, we apply a transform, and so on. And so quite often, we're going to want to use a gizmo to transform objects. And so we're going to have to switch between the selection tools and one of the three transformation buttons. Fortunately, to switch from one of these tools to the selection tool, we don't have to click on those buttons each time. And that's good because the keyboard shortcuts are quite infamous. For example, the Move tool shortcut is Shift space bar plus G. It's totally unusable. So if we use the Move tool, for example, we can still make selections with the Tweak tool or with the last selection tool we used before, in this case with the lasso. The setting is here in this menu called Drag. Basically here we can tell Blender what to do when we drag the mouse outside the gizmo. That is to say, when we click with the mouse inside the viewport without touching the gizmo. So there in the drag menu, we have select lasso. So Blender uses the lasso, but we can tell it to use the rect box instead. That works too. We also have the active tool choice. That's not very interesting, because it simply means that if we drag the mouse outside the gizmo, we will no longer be able to make a selection. But we will use the active tool instead. So here the Move tool to transform the selection using View Axis. Remember, using View Axis to transform an object is, for instance, moving object to left, right, top, or bottom according to our view. It's like using the white circle of the gizmo. And for that we know a much more effective way by using a shortcut. In this case, to move an object, you can use the G key. So now you know you can work with Move, Rotate, or Scale transformation tool and still be able to make a selection with a specific selection tool. We can even display the three gizmos at the same time with this tool we haven't seen yet. The Transform tool offers us a 3-in-1 gizmo that allows you to do the three types of transformation, so rotation, displacement, and scale. Personally, I don't really like this 3-in-1 gizmo. It is okay now because to record the tutorials, I use a small screen resolution. But when we work in 4K, the gizmo becomes very small, and in this situation, it is more than likely that we click on a wrong gizmo. There, between the arrow which represents the Move tool and the square which represents the Scale tool, the space is so short that when wanting to make a move, we can accidentally make a scale instead. By the way, it allows me to give you a very useful tip. If you accidentally triggered a transformation, or if finally you no longer want to do the transformation you started, rather than validating the operation and cancel it with Ctrl-Z, you can just do a right-click, and it puts everything back as before. It's very, very practical. You can also change the type of transformation after starting one. Here I am doing a scale on Z, but without validating or canceling anything, I can always press the G key. And there I'm moving the object along Z axis, as I wanted to do initially. And it also works for rotation with the R key for trigger a rotation along Z axis. Parenthesis closed. I'm also not a big fan of displaying all the gizmos at the same time because the Move gizmo loses the little squares that represent the plane between two axes, and I really like to use them. You will see on your side what works best for you, but be aware that displaying all gizmos at the same time means losing some functionality. So now we know how to keep the benefit of Selection tool while using a transformation gizmo. But we can also do the opposite. Work with a Selection tool while being able to make transformations with gizmos. So of course, if we use the Selection tool, we no longer have a gizmo. But if you go to this menu, the Gizmo menu, you can say that the Move, Rotate, or Scale gizmo is displayed when you're in selection mode. For example, here with the Move gizmo, you can even display several gizmos at the same time. For example here, Move and Rotate. Move, Rotate, and Scale. And we meet again the Transform Tools gizmo. And we can do all the combinations Move and scale, etc. For my part, when I pose or model a miniature, I mainly move with the G key, so without needing gizmo, but for rotations, I like to have my little gizmo. So what I do, I display the rotation gizmo. So I always have the rotate gizmo on my side. I can use the G key to move objects, and I still be able to use my select box to select objects. I think we have done a great tour around selection. Obviously, there are other very powerful ways to make selections. For example, selecting groups of objects in a single click, but we'll see that in the video in which we'll talk about the outliner. Thank you for following this tutorial, which was a little longer than expected. And see you soon!